Good night, traveler. The light has faded, and outside the wind stirs the dust of forgotten roads. Settle into your lair, pull the blanket up to your chin, and close your eyes. Tonight, we won't dive into the chaos of battle, but into the silence before the storm, into that moment when truth becomes deadlier than the sword, and when a legend must feed on lies to survive. Prepare yourself for a tale that begins with the wind and ends with the quietest whisper in history. That whisper says, "The Khan is dead." Long live the Khan. Listen closely. We begin. The wind, that was the first thing everyone remembered later, those who survived the summer siege of Shixia. It wasn't an ordinary wind. It was an enemy in its own right, ceaseless, shrill, full of sand from the Ordos desert, grinding down the stone walls of the imperial city like a giant sheet of sandpaper. It crept through every crack, spilled into food, blinded the guards, and whispered a single word into the ears of the desperate: ruin. On the ramparts that once proudly bore the banners of the Tangut Kingdom of Western Xia, men now stood staring into the gray haze of campfires that covered the plain like open, festering wounds. Among them was Li Chen. 22 years old, his face still smooth, but his eyes already as old as the walls themselves. He was no soldier by blood. Before the war, he was a pinyin jiang, an interpreter and learned scribe at the court of Emperor Li Xianzhong. He knew Chinese characters, Tangut script, Tibetan, and, as fate would have it, Mongolian, learned from merchants along the Silk Road. "What do you see today, sharp-eyed boy?" rasped the old man commanding their section. They called him Old Crane, for his long, bent neck and sharp profile that resembled the patient bird. Li Chen didn't answer at once. He watched the vast Mongol camp stretching to the horizon. "I see order," he said slowly. "That's what's strange. 6 months ago, when they arrived, there was chaos in that order. Wild, hungry chaos. Now it's like a clockwork machine greased with blood." He was right. The Mongol army that terrified the world now worked its destruction with depressing mechanical precision. Catapults hurled stones at fixed intervals. Archers loosed volleys on command. Everything moved, but without spark, without that savage joy of ruin that had been their signature. And at the center of it all, on a low hill, stood the great yurt, a black felt colossus, ringed by white standards with 9 horse tails, symbols of the supreme ruler. The seat of Temujin, son of Yasujii, who had conquered the clouds and taken the name Genghis Khan, Oceanic Lord. For months, no envoy had emerged from its doors. For months, no light had touched the old wolf sitting on his heap of furs. Yet every dawn, a courier in a gray cloak left the circle of guards, carrying a birch bark cylinder to the command tent where the Khan's sons and the legendary General Subutai waited. And after the cylinder passed through their hands, drums thundered and the machines moved again. Always at the same time. With terrifying, merciless regularity. "Why doesn't he come out?" Li Chen murmured one evening, more to himself than to Old Crane. "Why doesn't he ride out to show us it's still him crushing us? Why hide in that black tent?" Old Crane looked at him with eyes that had seen cities fall. "Maybe, boy, he doesn't need to show himself anymore. Maybe he just is. And that's enough." Then, as the sun bled into the horizon, Li Chen saw it. From behind the hill of the great yurt, a small, inconspicuous caravan rolled out. 3 low wagons drawn by sturdy Mongol ponies, flanked by 20 riders. Not princes in gold-embroidered robes, men in dark brown cloaks, members of the Kashik, the personal guard allowed to sleep on the Khan's threshold. The middle wagon was shrouded in black felt so tightly it had no window, no crack. The caravan didn't pass through the main gate of the camp. It slipped through a little used postern and headed northwest, away from the battlefield, toward the jagged mountains locals called the Wolf Hills. They moved silently, swiftly, with an urgency that was palpable even from this distance. Li Chen watched their silhouettes vanish into the deep dusk of the valley, and felt an icy grip tighten around his throat. It made no sense. No warlord, least of all the greatest of them, sends away his most loyal, most feared guard in the midst of a decisive siege. No ruler leaves his tent at night, in secret, like a thief spiriting away treasure. The thought that rose in his mind was so monstrous, so utterly insane, it nearly knocked him to his knees. He clutched the cold stone of the battlements, gasping for breath. What if? What if that yurt is empty? What if no one sits inside? No one breathes? The wind, as if reading his thoughts, struck the walls with renewed fury and howled in an inhuman tone. In the Mongol camp below, a bronze gong sounded, the signal for evening calm. But to Li Chen, it didn't sound like the end of the day. It sounded like the first nail driven into a coffin. A coffin meant for his entire city, though none of its defenders knew they were no longer fighting a king, but his empty throne. With a heavy heart, he climbed down from the walls. His steps led to the ruined library in a former temple, now his quarters. In the dim light of an oil lamp, he tried to gather his thoughts. He had to tell someone. But who would believe him? Who would accept the idea that the deadliest weapon of the Mongols was no longer their Khan, but his corpse, and the living fear of it? In the Mongol command tent, Prince Ogidi, third son of the great Khan, stared at the scroll delivered in the birch cylinder that morning. The orders were written in the familiar, elegant hand of Yek, the Khan's chief scribe. Instructions for the assault on the southern Barbican, detailed, brutal, brilliant in their simplicity. Everything as it should be. Except for one tiny detail at the very end. Instead of the seal bearing the Khan's emblem, a falcon clutching the sun, there was only a small, inconspicuous dot. As if the pen had sunk into the paper and left nothing but this mark. Ogidi gazed at the dot, his face an unreadable mask. Then he drew a knife with a jade hilt from his belt and carefully, almost tenderly, cut off the lower part of the scroll bearing the mark. He held the scrap over the flame of a small brazier warming the tent. The paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash, which the draft scattered. Tomorrow, Ogidi said in a calm, metallic voice to his brother Talyui, who stood in the shadows. We strike the southern gate. With all our strength. As our father wishes. The word father hung in the heavy, smoke-laden air like a curse. And outside, beyond the walls of the desperate city, the wind kept blowing from the Wolf Hills, carrying the chill of mountain peaks in the first, invisible threads of a web of lies meant to strangle the truth before it could even cry out its name. Li Chen's suspicion would not let him sleep. The image of that black wagon vanishing into the mountains gnawed at his mind like a worm. He couldn't go to the commanders with mere intuition. He needed proof. The chance came 3 nights later. A patrol caught a Mongol scout creeping toward the waste channel. He was pierced by a spear, but still alive. The officers needed an interrogation. And they needed Li Chen. Ask him about the forces at the northern gate, ordered Old Crane. The wounded Mongol lay on the ground, his breath a ragged rasp. His eyes, small and dark as a boar's, wandered across Li Chen's face. Li Chen spoke, his Mongolian harsh but clear. He asked the prescribed questions. The Mongol stayed silent. Then Li Chen, driven by an impulse stronger than orders, bent close and whispered into his ear. I saw them leave. Your brothers, the Kashik. With the black wagon. Where are they taking your lord's burden? The dying man's eyes widened in sudden terror. Not fear of death, he was clearly reconciled to that. It was fear of something else. Fear of revelation. He shook his head, his mouth contorted in a silent scream. Then he exhaled for the last time. With the secret. But that reaction was proof enough for Li Chen. In the days that followed, he watched the camp more closely than ever. He noticed that couriers still brought orders from the great yurt, but none of them ever entered or left it physically. They handed the cylinders to guards at the outer ring. He noticed, too, the oppressive silence around the black tent. No laughter, no shouting, no stir. Only the wind playing with the horsehair standards. 2 days later, on a risky night patrol along a less guarded section of the walls, moonlight struck him, and in its glow he saw something that froze his breath. Movement. The caravan was returning. The same riders, the same wagons. Only the middle one, the black one, was now empty. It rolled lightly, almost buoyantly. The journey to the mountains and back had taken 6 days. What could they have done in 6 days? Taken something heavy, something secret. And returned without it. Ice filled his veins. Now he knew. It wasn't just a hunch. The game being played in the camp below had terrifying rules. And he might be the only soul in all Shixia beginning to understand them. The next morning, as drums thundered and Mongol engines unleashed their symphony of destruction, Li Chen lifted his eyes from the writing desk in the ruins of the library. He gazed across the plain at the black yurt on the hill. You're playing chess with us, he whispered into the silence, but you're no longer on the board. And that makes you the most dangerous opponent of all. While Li Chen wrestled with shadows in Shixia, in the Mongol command tent Subutai, the old dog of war, slid another scroll into a birch cylinder. It was the order to prepare for the final assault. Tomorrow, he said to Ogdi. Time to end this comedy. Ogdi merely nodded. His gaze fixed on the empty space where his father's carpet lay. Comedy, yes. But who had ever seen a place so dreadful, where the lead actor was dead and the audience didn't know? Truth is poison. And Li Chen was now poison to the marrow. He couldn't keep it inside. He summoned his courage and requested an audience with the commander of the Southern Barbican, General Gao Liangchu, a man famed more for stubbornness than for wit. Excellency, Li Chen began in the smoke-filled room strewn with maps and broken weapons. The Mongols, their Khan is no longer among them. General Gao stopped sharpening his sword. He looked up. What? I saw them carry his body. Into the mountains. Their command acts from a lie. They fear that if the truth spreads, their army will lose its spirit. This is our chance. If we send envoys armed with this truth. He never finished. General Gao rose, his face flushed more from outrage than from the wine he'd drunk. You dare advise me to believe a fairy tale about a dead king, he thundered. It's their trick. They want us to leave the walls thinking we can negotiate, and then they'll butcher us like sheep. It's no trick, I saw. What you saw was deceit. Gao slammed his fist on the table. Genghis Khan is a demon. Demons do not die. They only change form. As long as we see his tent, we feel his threat. That's enough. Your truth, boy, is a weapon they've slipped into our hands. And we will not take it. Li Chen wanted to protest, but Gao's hand cut the air. Silence. Speak of this to anyone else and you'll be branded a spy. Your head will rot on a pike. Do you understand? Li Chen understood. He said nothing more. He bowed and left. In that moment, he learned his first bitter lesson: for the defeated, the illusion of safety is worth more than dangerous truth. His city would rather lock itself in the cage of its own fear. That night, the Mongols set the suburbs ablaze. Flames lit the darkness, illuminating ruin. People on the walls wept and screamed. Li Chen watched as General Gao urged his men to fight, his voice full of blind fury. A man battling a shadow, convinced it was a real monster. And in the Mongol camp? Subutai watched the fire from his tent. He smiled, a dry, joyless smile. Good, he said to Ogdi. A little more fear. A little more fire. And then we finish it. Ogdi did not look at the flames. He looked at the stars, wondering if he would ever rule anything but the fear of his father. The warmth of the command tent smelled of goat fat, smoke, and tension. Ogdi, his body broad and powerful like a bear, sat on a low stool. Before him stood Subutai, whose wrinkles looked like maps of conquered lands. Tomorrow, Subutai said, his voice scraping like a blade on stone. We throw everything at the southern Barbican. The final order is clear. Ogdi lifted his eyes from the cup of kumis. Final, he asked. The word hung in the air. Subutai paused. His gaze confirmed what no one spoke aloud. The last cylinder had arrived yesterday. No gong had sounded for a new day. The plan handed down to us must be fulfilled before the full moon. The plan the great ruler himself set for this eventuality. Ogdi drank. The bitter liquid brought no comfort. To rule in expectation was easy. To rule in shadow was something else entirely. He always said strength lies not in the arm, but in the faith the arm inspires, Ogdi murmured, more to himself. Now I understand. Subutai nodded. Faith is a weapon. Now it's ours. We'll use it to break their walls. And then, he left the sentence unfinished. And then we'll have to build something new. Without his voice. Outside, a crash rang out, a catapult loosed its payload. A stone ball struck Shixia's walls with a deep, resonant thud. The echo rolled across the camp. To Ogdi, it didn't sound like the music of victory. It sounded like relentless pounding on the gates of an empty hall. Morning did not come with dawn, but with a scream. A scream of thousands of throats rising from the Mongol camp like a terrifying wave, followed by a blow Shixia had never endured. It wasn't a coordinated strike on one gate. It was a flood of pure, indiscriminate fury, surging against the walls from every side at once. As if the steppe itself had risen in revolt and hurled itself at stone. Li Chen woke in the ruins of the library, where he had fallen asleep over scrolls he no longer had strength to read. The walls trembled. Dust and pebbles rained from the ceiling. He ran outside, into the chaos of alleys. Everywhere, people swarmed like ants from a shattered nest. Women screamed, children wailed, men rushed to the battlements with whatever weapons they could find, axes, pitchforks, splintered wood. What's happening? He shouted at a running soldier. I don't know. They're everywhere. Like they've lost their minds. Li Chen scrambled up the nearest watchtower. The sight stole his breath. The Mongols weren't attacking in formations. They were charging. Climbing ladders, grappling over walls, scrambling over each other. Their faces weren't lit with battle frenzy, but something worse, blank, mechanical rage. They killed without cries, without calls. Just killed. It was as if someone had unleashed a storm, and the storm had iron teeth. And then it struck him. This was no planner's assault. This was the fury of heirs who wanted to bury their father beneath the ruins of a city, so no one would ever ask again. General Gao, on the opposite wall, bellowed orders that vanished in the roar. His face was crimson, veins bulging like they might burst. He saw his system, his disciplined defense, collapsing under the weight of something that resembled a natural disaster more than a military maneuver. Li Chen descended from the tower. On the way, he met Old Crane. The old man stood leaning on his spear, his gaze calm, almost resigned. "So this is the end, boy," he said simply. "They fight as if fire is behind them. Or as if it's ahead, and they want to run into it." At that moment, a young messenger, barely grown, his face pale with terror, rushed to Li Chen. "Master Interpreter. General Gao demands your presence at the southern gate. At once." Li Chen forced his way through the chaos. The southern Barbican was hell. Stone walls slick with blood and oil, air thick with smoke and screams. General Gao seized him by the cloak, his eyes wild. You're dead, Khan," he hissed into Li Chen's face, his breath stinking of fear and wine. "Look at this. Is this his work? The work of a dead man?" He pointed to the massacre beyond the walls. Mongols hurled themselves at the defenders in such numbers that their own dead formed a ramp for the living to climb. "No," Li Chen said softly, but had to shout to pierce the din, "this is the work of living men who fear the truth about a dead man will destroy them. They're killing their own fear with our blood." General Gao stared at him as if he didn't understand. Then something flickered in his eyes, not comprehension, but a deeper, more primal terror. Terror at the thought that he wasn't fighting a tyrant, but a dreadful emptiness left behind. An emptiness perhaps hungrier still. He turned and roared orders again, but now his voice was shrill, on the edge of madness. Li Chen knew the general would never accept his truth. But here, in this inferno, he saw that truth had ceased to matter. All that remained was rage on one side and horror on the other. And between them, a silent, black wagon long gone, yet still commanding everything that happened here. The southern Barbican fell at dusk. Not with a heroic crash, but with a choking gasp as the last defenders were crushed beneath Mongol numbers. Li Chen survived only because Old Crane dragged him into a waste channel, a dark, stinking tunnel running beneath the walls. They crawled for an hour, maybe two, lost in absolute blackness, guided only by the rustle of rats ahead and the distant, muffled roar bleeding through wet stone. When they finally emerged, they were far beyond the battle lines, in an abandoned olive grove on a slope above the city. From there, through sparse branches, they had a terrifyingly perfect view of Xixia. The city burned. Flames painted shifting orange maps of ruin on the black canvas of night. The sounds that reached them were no longer war cries, but the howls of victors and the wailing of the defeated. Old Crane leaned against a tree and wept silently. Li Chen felt no tears, only a vast, hollow exhaustion and a searing need to know. "I have to go back," he said quietly. "What? Are you mad?" "No. I have to know. I have to find the answer." "Why?" He knew Old Crane wouldn't stop him. The old man was an empty vessel now. Li Chen left him his cloak and most of his water, then walked back toward the infernal glow. It wasn't hard to slip inside. The Mongols were drunk on victory, chaos was absolute. He crept through alleys he knew like his own hands, avoiding the main streets where looting and slaughter raged. His goal wasn't the palace or the treasury. It was the Mongol camp, specifically its edge, where tents for supply units and the wounded stood. He knew what he was looking for, something very specific. An old man, not a soldier, but a healer or a priest. Someone who might know the truth, but lacked the power to wield it. He found him near the prisoners' enclosure. An old Mongol with a face like a shriveled apple peel, dressed in a filthy but once fine silk robe now stained with blood. He was tending a wounded boy, his grandson, perhaps, with clumsy, trembling care. When Li Chen stepped into the glow of their small fire, the old man looked up. His eyes, clouded by age and smoke, fixed on Li Chen without fear. Only with deep sorrow. Li Chen sat opposite him, wordless. He pulled the last piece of flatbread from his bag and offered it. The old man hesitated, then accepted and broke it in half. Half for the boy. Half for himself. You seek the truth, the old man said suddenly, his voice a rasping whisper. He spoke Tangut with a heavy accent. You are the interpreter. You saw the wagon. Li Chen nodded, too exhausted for surprise. Why? He asked in a single word. The old man stared into the fire. He, the great Khan, did not die in battle. He died at night. Inside. Collapse. Wounds from a hunt months ago. Infection. Fever. He closed his eyes. I was there. I tried. I was cast out when I said nothing more could be done. They, his sons and Subutai, had a plan. A plan for the end. A plan? Li Chen breathed. Yes. His last orders were not about empire. They were about vengeance. On the Tanguts who delayed aid. Let my body never see the sun over a fallen Shixia, he said. But let my death never see its rise. Li Chen froze. It was terrifyingly brilliant. And terrifyingly futile. So all of this hell, is just a funeral rite? His voice broke. The old man nodded, tears carving paths down his wrinkled cheeks. It is a ritual. A ritual to turn his death into another weapon. If the world knew he died before the city fell, they would say the Tanguts defeated him. That his spirit was broken. So the city must fall. It must burn. And it must fall in his name. His body is gone. His will must live in fire. Outside, an explosion shook the earth as a tower collapsed somewhere in the city. Flames leapt high into the sky, lighting the old man's face with agony. Run, boy, he whispered. This truth will not save you. It will only poison you. Go. And if you live, forget. Because he pointed a bony finger toward the camp's heart, where the great yurt still loomed untouched, they will never forget. And they will never stop needing us to believe he is still inside. Li Chen rose. He felt older than the mountains surrounding the valley. He thanked the old man without words and walked back into the darkness, carrying a burden heavier than any he had ever borne. A truth worse than any lie. Truth is a heavy stone. Li Chen now carried it in his chest, weighing him down with every step back from the charred ruins to the olive grove. Old Crane still sat there, unmoving as a tree root. Well, the old man asked without lifting his eyes. It was a funeral rite, Li Chen exhaled, collapsing beside him. All of it. This hell. Just a sacrificial ritual, so his spirit would not leave the fight defeated. Old Crane nodded slowly, as if he had expected it. And what will you do with that truth? That was the question. What could he do? He knew the Mongol command would quarter him for this knowledge. His own people would not believe him, or would brand him a heretic and a spy, like General Gao. Truth itself was powerless. But it was the only weapon he had. The decision came with dawn. He took his bow, the only thing he had saved from the library. It wasn't a war bow, but a hunter's, carved from supple ash. He tied a narrow strip of his robe to an arrow. Then, using a piece of charred wood, he wrote a single sentence in 3 languages, Tangut, Chinese, and Mongolian. His hand trembled, but the words were clear. The Khan died before the fall. His body is in the mountains. He didn't believe it would stop the massacre. But he believed it might plant a seed that might one day grow and crack the foundations of the lie upon which the new rulers now built. He chose a position on a shattered section of the wall not yet swarming with Mongols. He drew the string, aimed high so the arrow would fall in the center of the square before the great yurt, where the officers gathered. He loosed. The arrow with its black pennant of truth soared skyward, arced, and began its descent. Li Chen held his breath. He watched its path as it plunged toward the cluster of Mongol commanders arriving on horseback. It struck the ground barely 10 paces from the first rider. A man in a deerskin cap, a lesser officer, leapt down and snatched it up. He read the inscription. His face turned chalk white. He spun and ran to the nearest senior commander, holding out the arrow. And then something happened Li Chen had not expected. The senior officer, instead of ordering a frantic search for the shooter, smashed his fist into the younger man's face so hard he crumpled. He seized the arrow, broke it across his knee, and hurled the fragments into the nearest fire. Then he barked at the surrounding soldiers. His words didn't carry, but his gestures were unmistakable. You saw nothing. And then, like a signal prepared in advance, the drums roared across the camp. Not a call to retreat or to hunt the archer. It was the rhythm of attack. Louder, fiercer than before. From Shixia's gates poured fresh Mongol detachments, not to defend their camp from slander, but to strike with new, even more brutal force at the last pockets of resistance in the city. It was as if the mere mention of that truth had unleashed greater fury. Li Chen watched flames spread into districts that had barely burned before. He heard new screams. And he understood. He had not erred in sending the arrow. He had erred in thinking truth could change anything. For the victors, truth was no threat. It was a provocation, a challenge to make their lie real by erasing everyone who might remember otherwise. He withdrew from the wall, his heart pounding with bitterness worse than fear. Truth had not triumphed. It had become the catalyst for greater violence. It was a race between the blade and the pen, between fire and the word. And in this race, the word was doomed. 2 days later, it was over. Resistance in Shixia guttered out, the last desperate fights smothered in alleys choked with corpses. The Mongols now ruled a smoking ruin. And in the heart of this chaos, a strange ceremony unfolded. Li Chen, now a prisoner with shackled hands, was among the handful brought to the main square before the imperial palace. Once, Tangut emperors had received homage here. Today, Mongol princes and generals stood in a circle. At its center rose a plain but massive wooden seat. Upon it sat Ogdi. He wore no crown. There was no ornate diadem. But the ritual that followed was all the more powerful for its starkness. Subutai stepped forward and knelt, not before Ogdi, but before the empty space beside the seat. He began to speak loudly, his voice carrying across the square. I swear by the eternal blue sky that I will serve faithfully our great Khan, Temujin, son of Yasugi, who is with us in spirit, and his heir, who sits in his place. One by one, the Mongol lords approached and repeated the oath. They did not say, I swear to Ogdi. They said, I swear to our great Khan, and his heir. It was a linguistic trick, brilliant in its simplicity. Genghis Khan was not declared dead. He was made eternal. And Ogdi was not a new ruler. He was merely the earthly steward of the place. Li Chen watched in frozen awe. He saw armed defiance of reality transform into official dogma. The corpse in the mountains was no shame to hide. It became the cornerstone of a new religion, a religion of eternal, invisible rule. Real power was not in the man on the seat. It was in the emptiness beside him, in the shadow all must worship. When the ritual ended, Ogdi rose. His gaze swept the line of captives and paused on Li Chen. In his eyes was no hatred, no mockery. Only a cold, analytical interest, as if studying a rare, venomous insect. Then he gestured to one of the guards. After the feast that followed, the ceremony where they drank to the health of the eternal Khan, Li Chen was led to the tent of an officer. Not a prisoner's tent. A scribe's. You can read and write. In many tongues, said the Mongol officer, a sharp-eyed man named Bork. You can be useful. You know a certain truth. But we know a greater truth. The truth of what the empire needs. You will serve. And you will be silent. It was an offer that was no offer at all. It was a command dressed in the robes of mercy, to serve a new order built on a lie he himself had uncovered. To become living proof that even one who knew the truth could become its silent custodian. Li Chen nodded. He had no choice. In that moment, he understood the final lesson: truth had not died. It had been absorbed, assimilated, into the system that now ruled it, reshaped for its own ends. His task was now to help write a history that would turn a great lie into an eternal myth. 10 years after Shixia ceased to exist, an old man walked along the dry bed of the Yellow River. His face was carved by wind and time, his eyes holding only calm, extinguished resignation. It was Li Chen. Service to the Mongols had not killed him. It had simply hollowed him out. He translated decrees, compiled tax registers, recorded the official version of history, where Genghis Khan fell only after Shixia lay in ashes. He became a living tomb for his own secret. One autumn afternoon, as the sun painted the steppe in gold, he met another old man, a former Kashik rider, now herding scrawny goats. They sat together on a stone, sharing a skin of sour milk in silence. After a long pause, the Mongol elder pointed with his staff toward the northwest, to the blue silhouettes of mountains. You know, he rasped, his tandet shaky but clear, there is no grave there. Only, a place. A place the wind knows. Li Chen looked at him. Isn't that necessary? He asked softly. A place where a new Khan can bow. The old man chuckled, a dry, helpless laugh. A new Khan? A new Khan bows to the story. The story of a grave no one can find. That is stronger. Fear of what is hidden is greater than fear of what you can see and destroy. Legion understood. The last piece of the puzzle slid into place. The subtlest trick was not hiding the body. It was hiding the fact that the body was only a body. Turning physical death into intangible, eternal fear. All these years he thought he served a lie. In truth, he served something far greater, a myth. And a myth, as he knew from his own translations, outlives kings, empires, and truth itself. He rose carefully, thanked the old man without words, and walked on along a road that led nowhere. He felt a strange release. The burden he had carried for years crumbled into dust. He no longer bore a secret. He bore only its echo, a story that would live on, told by Mongol storytellers, Chinese chroniclers, Arab scholars. A story of a ruler who, even in death, never ceased to conquer. He stopped and turned to the mountains one last time. The wind, the same faithful messenger, rose and lifted a cloud of golden dust. For an instant, it seemed to shape the outlines of a wagon, of horses, riding into oblivion. He smiled. For the first time in years, it was a smile without bitterness. He had nothing left to hide. Because the best hiding place is not a dark cave. It is the light of legend, where no conscience can reach. He raised the collar of his cloak and walked on. Behind him lay the Wolf Hills, a city of ghosts, and an empire learning to rule by shadow. Before him stretched only steppe and wind, endless and liberating. And so, dear listener, our story ends not with a fall, but with a dissolution. Because sometimes the greatest victory is not to defeat an enemy, but to become a story that cannot be stopped. A story that now, when you close your eyes, you may hear whispering in the wind beyond your window. Good night.